The sound that registered first wasn't the estate attorney's voice reading figures aloud. It was my aunt's laughter, a bright, rehearsed sound, as she received confirmation that the bulk of my grandmother Nora's estate, nearly $4 million in liquid assets and property holdings, was going to her. Then the attorney slid a single sheet toward me. A symbolic bequest, $1,000, and a sealed envelope marked with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. My uncle didn't bother pretending to look apologetic. "You've always been resourceful, Delia," he said. "You'll land somewhere." My aunt touched her pearl earring and smiled at her daughter, Prue, who was seated beside her and said nothing, even though we had grown up sleeping in rooms across the hall from each other. I kept both hands flat on the conference table and didn't speak. Have you ever sat in a room where your erasure was being administered professionally, with a notary present? I grew up in a family where belonging was conditional, and the conditions were never written down. My grandmother, Constance, had raised me alongside my cousins after my parents died in a car accident when I was 6. She was capable and unsentimental, but she saw me not always warmly, not always fairly, but she saw me. Her daughter, my Aunt Renata, ran the household's social calendar. Her son-in-law, my Uncle Philip, handled the family's financial affairs. I was the one who filled the gaps, scheduling contractors, managing Constance's medical paperwork, tracking insurance appeals, coordinating the accountant's quarterly visits. "Delia's thorough," Renata would say to guests, the same tone she'd use to describe a reliable appliance. I worked in healthcare compliance. I spent my days auditing billing records, identifying irregularities in documentation, tracing patterns across financial cycles. The work required patience and an ability to see what numbers obscured rather than what they revealed. Philip knew what I did for a living. He never once asked me about it. Constance had taught me to be quiet and observant. She kept a small garden behind the house, and on weekend mornings when I was young, she would take me outside before anyone else was awake. She'd crouch by the beds, pulling weeds with deliberate fingers. "You notice things, Delia," she told me once without looking up. "Don't let anyone talk you out of that." She never explained what she meant. She didn't need to. I understood my place by the time I was 12. Prue was the daughter of the house, celebrated, amplified, forwarded. I was the one who made things run. At Prue's 16th birthday, I spent the afternoon setting up folding tables and ferrying platters from the kitchen. I overheard her tell a neighbor, "Delia doesn't need the same things Prue does. She's always been self-contained." I carried 2 more platters and said nothing. That sentence became a fixture in me, something I returned to without meaning to. In their version of the family, not needing things meant not deserving them. I understood that, eventually I would have to decide whether to keep proving them right. The morning after the estate reading, I left the attorney's office before Renata could suggest we all have lunch. I drove to the small inn on the eastern edge of town where I'd stayed once before, years ago, during a work trip. The owner remembered me. She handed me a key and didn't ask questions. In the room, I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Constance, a smaller folded note, and a short sequence of numbers. The letter was sparse. It said, "I have watched this family arrange the truth to suit themselves for a long time. You were the only one who never asked me to." Below the numbers, she had written one line, "The filing cabinet in the study. The brown key on the ring." I read the letter 4 times. Then I opened my laptop. What followed was not emotional. It was methodical. I pulled the records Philip had filed on Constance's behalf over the previous 8 years. I knew where to look because I had helped organize them. I cross-referenced them against the public filings for the small family holding company he managed. I flagged the irregularities in yellow. Then I flagged the patterns in red. Rounded transfers. Advisory fees billed to accounts Constance had never authorized in writing. A series of documentation gaps that individually could be explained away. Together they formed a shape I recognized immediately from my professional work. Someone had been redirecting assets for years, carefully, in amounts that would not trigger automatic review. I drove to Constance's house after dark. Renata and Philip's cars were in the driveway. I let myself in through the side entrance. They were in the sitting room. I heard Philip's voice carrying down the hallway. He was already discussing which accounts to consolidate. I moved quietly through the corridor to Constance's study. The filing cabinet opened on the first try. Inside were folders organized by year, printed emails, handwritten annotations, and a small digital recorder. A second envelope, sealed, addressed to me. Constance had built a record. Not out of fury, out of precision. She had watched, and she had documented, and she had waited for the right person to find it. I scanned what I needed, uploaded copies to 2 separate secure drives, and left before anyone passed the hallway. I heard Renata say my name as I reached the side door, not to me, just about me, dismissive and certain. I stepped out into the cold air and drove back to the inn. I worked until 2 in the morning, building a clean timeline. Dates, figures, signatures, gaps. The meeting Constance had arranged through her attorney took place 3 days later in the same conference room. I had not told Renata or Philip it was happening. They arrived expecting a formality. Constance's attorney, a quiet woman named Miss Varga, was already seated. She placed a folder on the table and a small audio device beside it. She pressed play. Constance's voice came through the speaker, steady and unhurried, as if she were in the next room. She spoke for 4 minutes. She described what she had found, what she had documented, and why she had chosen to structure the estate as she had. She named specific transactions. She referenced specific dates. Renata's posture changed within the first 30 seconds. Philip's jaw tightened. When the recording ended, Miss Varga opened the folder. The estate's secondary clause was clear. If the initial distribution were contested, the full remainder would transfer to a charitable medical foundation Constance had designated. The clause regarding potential legal review of advisory conduct was described in 3 careful sentences. Philip's face went still. I set the key from the filing cabinet on the table. A small, quiet sound. Renata looked at it as though it had said something she wasn't prepared to answer. "There's nothing left to clarify, Miss Varga said." I didn't speak. There was nothing I needed to add. Prue, seated at the end of the table, stared at her hands. She did not look at me. I noticed, without feeling much about it, that she hadn't looked at me once since the first meeting either. My uncle started to object. Renata placed her hand on his arm, once briefly. He stopped. They both understood that the room had already moved past them. I signed the acknowledgement documents, shook Miss Varga's hand and left. I stayed in town for another week, handling the transfer paperwork and meeting with the foundation's incoming director. I leased a small apartment on the other side of the city. 2 rooms with east-facing windows, quiet in the mornings, nothing that needed anything from me except the rent. I visited a therapist twice that month, not because I was falling apart but because I wanted to understand what I was actually feeling, which was less triumphant than I'd imagined and more like the particular silence that follows a long noise. She asked me if I was grieving. I sat with that for a moment. I said not them, exactly. The version of them I kept hoping would eventually appear. She nodded and wrote something down. The grief, if that's what it was for a door that had never actually been open. I had just taken years to stop knocking. There is no satisfaction in that kind of clarity, only the steadiness that comes after you stop arguing with what was always true. Renata sent one message, 3 weeks later. It was brief and suggested that things had been misunderstood and that family should come. I read it once. I didn't respond. Not out of anger. There was very little of that left. But because she had already answered every question I might have asked about what she meant by family. I keep Constance's letter in the left drawer of my desk. I don't read it often. I don't need to. It says what it says. I see you. I always did. That is the only inheritance that will never need a notary. Some people will tell you that family loyalty means absorbing whatever is asked of you without naming the cost. Others will say that walking away proves you never really loved them. Both arguments assume that staying silent and staying whole are the same thing. So I'll leave you with this. If someone in your life has been quietly maintaining the foundation everyone else stands on, Is the thanks they receive worth what it costs them to keep showing up?